Bienvenue à cette 5e présentation de Dialogue Danse Actuelle, un projet de médiation culturelle créé par Art-Circulation. Today we discuss with Kim-Sanh Châu, dance artist, choreographer, dance filmmaker, and Kevin Ah-Sen, artist, teacher, and PhD student in education at McGill University. Dialogue Danse Actuelle invite des artistes et des experts de différentes sphères professionnelles à discuter de sujets, d'enjeux contemporains tels que la politique, l'environnement, la société, l'inclusion, l'économie, les pratiques artistiques en général. Et je tiens à dire qu'en complément de ce live streaming, les artistes invités partagent des documents, des archives, des références de toutes sortes, de toute nature relatives à leur processus de création, à leur travail, ce qui les inspire, leurs intérêts aussi. Donc, on vous invite à les consulter sur le site de Art-Circulation. Donc, la conversation d'aujourd'hui porte sur le présent, les lieux, trouver une voie à travers les connexions, les solidarités et les réciprocités. Bienvenue, Kim-Sanh. Bienvenue, Kevin. Très heureuse de discuter avec vous aujourd'hui, après les échanges qu'on a eus avant. Donc, Kim-Sanh, tu es vietnamienne, tu es née en France et tu es arrivée au Canada, à Montréal, en 2012. Donc, tu as vraiment un parcours artistique très intéressant, super riche, qui combine plusieurs activités, le travail culturel, la chorégraphie, la vidéo aussi, la performance. Tu as un lien assez intime aussi avec le Vietnam dans tes créations artistiques. Est-ce que tu peux en dire un peu plus sur ton parcours, sur ton personnel, professionnel, sur ton travail?
Oui, bien sûr. Oui, en fait, c'est ça, ma pratique à plusieurs... I think I should speak in English right now.
As you like.
Je vais commencer en français alors. Mais c'est ça, dans le fond, ma pratique a plusieurs pans et facettes. Mais dans le fond, les quatre se regroupent puis vont dans une seule et même direction. Fait que tout se complémente. Mais c'est sûr que je passe beaucoup, le plus gros de ma pratique, c'est la chorégraphie et le travail culturel. Puis je travaille aussi, c'est ça, en tant qu'interprète et puis en vidéo-danse, qui finalement devient de la vidéo. Enfin, il y a de moins en moins de danse dans les vidéos. Et que ça évolue aussi, ça vit sa propre vie.
Kevin, you are a Mauritian. Your work engaged with Black studies, diasporic and queer relationship. You also are a sound artist, a storyteller, as well as being part of the group Montreal Steppers. Would you tell us more about yourself and the links between all these aspects of your personal and professional activities?
Ooh. Good question. It's a messy answer, though. Yeah, I think a lot about what it means to be free and what it means to be, or what it means to be in a space of liberation. And oftentimes I find myself in a place where I need to be attuned and I need to have engage in a practice of deep listening, whether or not that is amongst people in conversation or that is in the space that I occupy or in the space that I am engaged with, right? And so sound studies comes in that aspect, which taught me a lot about how to be in relationship with people and be in good relations with the land that I'm on, but also the kind of shared space that has been co-created. And part of that co-creation, I could speak to Montreal Steppers as a collective that was founded in 2019, but I think our friendships have kind of emerged before then, and so I would say the genealogy of that particular collective emerged way before that date that we kind of use to kind of advertise ourselves. But Montreal Steppers is a collective that uses stepping as an art form to communicate Black history, Black excellence, and Black joy. It is founded by a really dear friend of mine, Kai and Queely, so just a shout out. But kind of as a collective of friends that care a lot about the work that we do, that care a lot about freedom, that cares a lot about what it means to be in good relationship with each other. So yeah, I don't know if that really answered the question, but there are so many kind of links between all of these facets of my life, whether or not it's academic, artistic, personal, and yeah, so there you go.
I will cite both your bios a little bit, just to make this connection. Kevin, you are saying that, and I quote your words, that you seek to bring together young freedom dreamers to think and theorize together against anti-Blackness and settler colonialism, and to reimagine otherwise futures. And Kim, your work focuses on the creation anchored in a past with colonized identities. You express a deep concern for fairness and anti-oppression. So you both seem to share several common reflections and values around identity, relations of power, and as the title of the discussion, solidarities. So how would you engage in a conversation together around these topics?
I think the first thing for me is that there is those topics for me. They're interest, but they come from a sense of responsibility and also duty. And I think sometimes people they get confused. Oh, is it? Of course, it's an interest as well, but deep down, it's really in a sense of like, oh, I feel responsible as well as in a way that if you present work that is public, like dance, etc., and also as a cultural worker, I think it's important to take those subjects into account. And in a similar way, then there is a part of it that is very personal because of my background and also because of the community I evolve with, my friends and my dear ones. But there is also a desire to be also open to people I don't know. So I would start with that.
Yeah. I would like to kind of enter the conversation with the last point that you made, right, about entering or engaging with the people that you don't know, or maybe even future relationships that may emerge from that, right? And I think what's interesting about kind of operating in the not knowing is that it holds space for possibilities of different possibilities, right? So possibilities that are unimaginable before taking that step into the unknown. But I really resonate with what you're saying about that element of responsibility, because when we think about, for example, dance or choreography, all of which I think they're also ways of storytelling, right? They tell stories, or it's a particular grammar, right? A particular articulation of a feeling, of a desire, or even of a dream. And so when we enter in that kind of storytelling place, I think, like you were saying, this kind of reciprocity in relationship and accountability ties into the need to think about telling stories not just from your perspective, like you were saying, right? That these are also other people's stories that we're weaving in, stories that were kind of given to us, right? For us to then tell different stories or same stories, or tell them in the ways that we've understood them, and then keep that kind of telling going, right? So the need to respect those stories, right? To respect where those stories came from, and to be also cautious of, like, can we we tell those stories, right? Is it for us to tell those stories? Is it for us to own those stories and then to tell them again and claim them as our own? So I think a lot of what you said about responsibility and the element of accountability is extremely important in art making. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I'm always preoccupied by the fact that dance doesn't have a very large audience. So, and I have all those like questions about who do I make the work for, what am I saying, who am I saying it for, who do I represent, do I just represent myself, do I also represent communities, you know, how do people relate to the work? Yeah. And then, you know, all those questions, but also not, like, I'm really trying to not censor myself because of those questions, because otherwise you don't get to do anything. And then so I have all those like preoccupation versus like who actually go see the shows, which are like not that many people. So yeah. Yeah. I think dance is different than other, like I'm thinking other mediums like film or like writings, also because they have a life after, like on more on a long term, whereas dance shows they exist in the present only. So yeah, I have this.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to even think about the kind of the temporality of dance versus something that can be archived, right? Something that can last or kept. And I think what's interesting about that too is that it speaks to the different kinds of feelings and desires in that particular time and space. And sometimes it's also thinking about whether or not we need to tell the story to everyone, right? Whether or not it's just a very intimate moment between that audience and you, or that audience and the performer and the artist. I think a lot about also the kind of, you were talking about audience, but also in a way that reminded me of a conversation that we had previously about like gatekeeping certain types of cultural kind of references or whatnot. I like to think everything as an invitation, right? But not in a way that gives me permission to do everything and take everything, but you know, that demands a practice of responsibility and accountability where I have to also assess whether that invitation is for me to continue or engage with, right? So where do I not engage or where do I not accept, right, that invitation, as opposed to I need to, you know, find my way through, you know, through the obscurity of like gatekeeping and people who would kind of demean about cultural practices, as opposed to someone who keeps you accountable to your cultural practice, because there's a difference in that aspect, right? About whether or not I want you to do something, or that, and for the sake of accuracy, and for the sake of like this purest idea of like this is what it looks like and this is what it should always look like, versus you could take this and do it, but also assess and think critically about how you're doing it and how you make it contemporary, right, or whatever that means. Yeah, I digress, but yeah, yeah, I think a lot about that.
But that makes me think of the, you know, the bridges you're trying to trying to build with communities, with audiences. Like I find that contemporary dance, because it's contemporary art, it has some like elitism anchored, and so I'm often questioning like, okay, once I know who I make the work for, blah 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 blah, then it's also like how do I communicate with the people I want to communicate with, you know, in an art form that can be very rigid, you know, or very cold. And yeah, I think there are ways, you know. But contemporary dance is not the easiest.
No. Yeah, or what constitutes as contemporary,
Yeah, well, it's like what you were saying and what you were asking yourself pretty often, for whom do I create dances, and how do you anticipate criticism, whether it comes from the diaspora, which we will talk later, the concept of diaspora, or from general public that attends contemporary dance in general. So how do you anticipate that? It comes back to this sense of accountability, responsibility, or...
Yeah, and what do you care for? You know, like, I think we had this conversation about, yeah, it's going to take me a while to figure it out. But if I think about audience that come see my work, I know that I am trying to have a dialogue, like the work I'm making, I make it intentionally for diasporic people, because they're the people I relate with the most. It's also important for me to have like a feedback and a dialogue with BIPOC communities. But then for people who are not part of those communities, like how do I absorb their criticism or their feedback? You know, how do I take it into account in my process? Do I care really? You know? And it doesn't come from like intentions of excluding people, but it's a real question, and they know, because often they wouldn't criticize. Like, I think now we live in a time here where white folks wouldn't criticize de façon négative work made by BIPOC people, for example. You know, so, and how do you keep the conversation open? Or do you want to? Or, you know, like, how does that really work? I think it's important to not for me, it's important to do work for BIPOC people, but also I'm not interested in excluding ourselves from the rest of society. So how do we do that and still be part of the society, you know?
Yeah, we discussed about that subject of diaspora before in our previous dialogues, which is present in both your creative process, Kim-Sanh, and your studies or your activities, Kevin. You cited, among other things, the writings of LIEUX, who suggests that diaspora are not simply a collection of people and communities of individuals sharing like history or cultural markers, but it's like composed of person where emerges like this quest or this search for markers or for something that is empty or missing in their own story or their own self. So how does this way of approaching the diaspora inspire your own reflections or even your teachings or your creations?
Yeah, I could jump in. So yeah, LIEUX, who's a professor at York University, writes about diaspora in her essay, The Turn to Diaspora, where she talks about kind of the emergence of diaspora coming from a place of loss and displacement and dispossession. So in a way, it always situates folks in the diaspora in a place of loss, right, and displacement, and the need to negotiate that, right? And what's interesting about that kind of framework to think about is to think about what is my relationship as a child of a diaspora, right? In relation to knowing that it's from displacement, but on land that is also predicated on displacement of indigenous peoples, right? And the ongoing dispossessions of indigenous sovereignty and rights. And so that allows me to think in relationship to struggle as opposed to each group needing to find their own thing and then just leave it at that, right? As this kind of like siloed way of thinking, of community thinking, right? So instead of thinking about like what would a Hakka community or Hakka Mauritian community look like by themselves, instead of thinking about that and what that means, I'm more interested in what does that mean for us as Hakka people with long histories of dispossession and displacement, even in China, hundreds and thousands of years of history around that. What would that mean in relationship to today's Hakka people who are making sense of the world and making sense of themselves in the world, but also being responsible to the ongoing realities of displacement and dispossessions of indigenous peoples of this land, right? So my work and in the way I think about my work and also my small and various attempts at art making is relationality, right? And kind of which resonates with, what you've said earlier resonates with me about like, it's not just for me, right? That it's not just my own personal project, but it's one that is a collective engagement. It's a collective co-storytelling. It's one that chooses who I want to engage with and who I want to keep me accountable, right? And decide whether or not I want to take certain types of, or certain people's critiques as a metric for my own reevaluation or deep thinking about my work. Because we've constantly been criticized, right? We've constantly, our art or ourselves or our stories have always been under the scope and microscope of the white gaze, right? And so what would it mean for the, for the very little opportunities that we have to create those moments for ourselves, but then contend with what we've made or what we've created or what we've put out there, but have that be in relation with others who are also marginalized, right? Or who are also, have not had the platform to experiment and to explore. So I think we're always in a position of like constant fear and doubt about our work because I think we're still in that beginning phase of figuring out what it means for all of us and what it means to make art or what it means to enter academia, whatever that means for me, or to just be in community with people who are also asking those questions, right? Who are also struggling with those questions of accountability or even a return to diaspora for some of us even. So I don't know if that made any sense, but yeah.
I think it did, and if I go back to Lily Cho?
Yeah.
I wish I read that text before, like earlier in my life.
Yeah. Me too. Me too.
When I read it, when you sent it, I was like, oh. And something very striking for me, and you talked about it last time we discussed, is also the idea that what makes us diasporic is a sense of grief. And she also talks a lot about a homeland that is imaginary. And in many ways, like that's what I've been looking for, like actually very explicitly, but I never read about it concretely, and I would like the imaginary homeland was very clear to me, but the sense of grief really highlighted something in my life, and I see it also in other, like a diasporic friend I have. It's really something that we have in common, and that we are like constantly trying to not figure something, but get somewhere. That we know that we won't get there, but we always have this desire, and that's what connects us, you know. And we do it through many different forms, and I find that fascinating, because it's also like, and we do it through different forms, and I also think that we do it through like stereotyped ideas about what our culture should be, you know, because often we don't know, so then we just grasp what we have, you know.
I remember you would say that the Vietnamese diaspora is different here in Canada than it was in France, because the history is different, and so are the stereotypes, I guess. So how do you deal with this notion of stereotypes and authenticity? Because and the question is addressed to you as well, Kevin, because you seem to have these thoughts about these matters, how accurate representation of culture within diasporas should be, or so we've talked a little bit about that, these differences.
Sure. So in my case, I was born in France, and the history of Vietnamese people migrating is different than the history of people here. I also come from my father is a boat people person, but on my mother's side we descend from French settlers who would have kids with Vietnamese women, so then those people would be excluded from the rest of society, and they would be very racist towards Vietnamese people, so I have this mixed background. And here, when I talk to folks who are like first generation immigrants, it's very beautiful, and their memories of Vietnam is stopped in the 70s and the 80s, and they continue like transmitting those stories. And I spend a lot of time in Vietnam usually, and it's very different than what I see in Vietnam. Of course, some of it stays the same, you know, but Vietnam is one of those countries that has changed very fast in the recent decades, and so the stories are different, and to me they're all very valuable and very rich. But it's a reality, and of course I don't tell them, look, it's what your stories are not really, but they're really in a certain period of time, and they fit and don't fit with the present and the future. And then I think your question about stereotypes, I think for me it's a very big and deep conversation. Like I think that any ethnicity carries this weight of stereotypes, or like ideas, like how people perceive us, and then how we think we should be perceived as well. And for me, the most striking one, the most heavy one in my life is about being Asian woman and being very often objectified, exotified, I don't know if it's a word. And it happens in many layers and many aspects of my life, and it happens all the time. And it took me a very long time to realize it, and it's actually through reading and listening to Black women who would talk about what their experience were, that I understood what my experience was, and that I'm not being perceived or treated in society as if I was a white person. And this happens in my personal but also professional life with people I don't know who they are when I go to a cafe, you know, and I learned a lot, and sometimes I wish I didn't learn that much, but
The more we know.
Yeah, that's the thing about awareness, you know, the more you hear, and then the more you're like, oh my God, that's what's happening to me, and then, you know, but it's also, it was a very reaffirming and validating experience to hear from other communities, and to be inspired also by how to live with it, you know.
Yeah, and also thinking about like, I contend with the word accuracy. It bugs me to the core, because it would require someone to gatekeep and set the tone for what is accurate and what is not. And that often falls under a particular gaze or a framework of dominance, right? So even within our own communities, right, if we think about diasporic peoples and communities, it's not homogenous, right? Similarly to the different experiences of Vietnamese diasporic people in different places, even thinking about, you know, my folks and Hakka people that have found homes in my case, in Mauritius, but also others who have found homes in Taiwan, our relationship to Hakka culture is very different. Our diasporic memories are very different, but also how we make sense of the world is also different. And I think that's because there's, again, storytelling, right? Because our histories, when they are in a particular place that has their own histories, and especially a place like here, where there are so many histories coming together and clashes of cultures, agreements and disagreements, or different kinds of relationships that emerge from these encounters, form new types of sense-making and meaning-making for diasporic communities. And so when I think about accuracy, it's like, well, you know, I'm sure the Hakka people in Taiwan would say whatever we do here is inaccurate, right? But in my case, I could care less, right? Because that's not my preoccupation, or maybe I do care. And maybe I need to ask myself those questions too.
It makes me think a little bit about this conversation we had with Charlie Prince the last time we had a dialogue. He was like talking about nostalgia as being a hack too. And it's like nostalgia refers to some authenticity as well, or things from the past that should be rewrite or recreate in the present. And yeah, it just make me think about this concept of nostalgia and authenticity. It's or accuracy.
Right.
It's pretty hard to like. Yeah. Who's the gatekeepers?
Right, because both those terms, right, accuracy and authenticity, would insinuate some sort of fixtured or fixated notion of what is and what is not, right, or anything less than is not, and that's problematic, right, as a way of thinking, and also just kind of, you know, people in the diaspora are constantly, you know, in the state of grief, right? In the state of meaning making, in which in the state of grief there's joy and there's love, right? I think to grieve is because you love, right? There was love in the first place, and so I think because we keep moving with that, right? And I want to maybe use the metaphors of dance and choreographies, is that this is like a choreography, right, that keeps on moving, that might end at a certain time, but gets picked up again at a different time in a different place. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to say something. I'm trying to say something here.
J'aimerais revenir sur ce que tu disais, Kim-Sanh, par rapport à le fait d'être une femme asiatique aussi. Tu as parlé dans les dernières conversations que tu avais été très touchée, même affectée par cet événement qui a eu lieu aux États-Unis, cette fusillade qu'il y a eu contre des femmes asiatiques, puis comment ça avait quand même aussi eu un impact sur ton travail aussi, ou sur tes questionnements ou tes recherches. Est-ce que tu aimerais parler de ça?
Sure. Ouais. I think it's, I mean, I've always been preoccupied by this topic, and I've talked about it a lot before to my friends, in the sense that I for the longest time I felt like people, men in particular, would behave a certain way with me because I'm Asian. And what happened in Atlanta really upset me, but also it validated some thoughts that I think a lot of people were experiencing or feelings, and then it became something that we could talk about more, you know. But for sure, I wanted to say something. Yeah, I don't know what I wanted to say, but it was interesting. Too bad. Yeah, but I think what I see in different, je vais le dire en français, mais ce que je vois dans plusieurs luttes de la part de communautés racisées notamment, aussi avec Black Lives Matter par exemple, c'est le moment où finalement on peut dire des choses que l'on expérimente sans être bâché. Comme moi, mon expérience, c'est vraiment de dire aux gens, je sens que les gens me traitent différemment, puis que les gens me disent non, ou ils me posent la question, ils me disent, mais est-ce que tu penses vraiment que c'est à cause de ceci, à cause de cela, nanana, puis it goes on and on and on, et c'est ça, et je trouve ça important que ça puisse être reconnu, parce que dès le moment où tu peux exposer les choses, ensuite tu peux parler, tu peux avoir une voix, et c'est une force. Et en ça, je trouve ça bien que ça soit exposé. Mais c'est sûr que j'ai trouvé ça super difficile de voir ce qui s'était passé à Atlanta, puis aussi le fait que c'était des travailleuses du sexe. Et puis parce que c'est des travailleuses du sexe, puis qu'elles sont asiatiques, c'est comme ça passe un peu à la trappe, puis c'est pas grave, c'est pas des vraies personnes. Je trouvais ça vraiment, vraiment difficile, puis c'est sûr que pour moi le premier stéréotype de la femme asiatique, c'est d'être objectifiée, c'est d'être, ouais.
And what's very disturbing about that is this idea of like, it requires death in order to validate, right, or to make a case, right? And even in death, there are so many attempts to disavow that, right? Like I was just thinking about that particular case where I think it was the police chief, and I forget his name, and I don't care about his name, but who literally in front of a public said that it was not a racialized, you know, attempt or whatever. It was not an act of racist, whatever. And to quickly humanize that person being, you know, mentally disturbed or whatnot, which is not my place to say that's not true, but it's this attempt to flip the script, right? So even in death, right, I would say even in death, it doesn't give any validation per se. But what I find extremely unsettling and heartbreaking is that it requires death, and even when that happens, it still is not enough, right? And so where do we go from there in terms of, or do we move away from that, right? From this idea of like needing these kind of violent examples to make a point, and if we stay in that, how long do we stay in that, right? And to what extent do we actually begin to heal? Because every time we enter back into those conversations of violence, we subject ourselves to the same trauma, to the hurt, not just the hurt from that particular violent incident, but again, the ongoing gaslighting and disavowing of our feelings, of our fear, of our lives, right? Of our trauma. So maybe my personal interest is not there, right? In terms of like seeking to make sense of everything through that particular lens, where it again centers white people as a metric for understanding, right? And what does that take away from me when I focus and stay in that place of preoccupation, of sadness and of anger? And that also kind of more broadly thinking about COVID, right? And the rise of anti-Asian violence that came with that. And even in those instances, it's still, people are just like, they would call it, you know, the Asian virus, and yet still disavow racism, right? When we call it out.
But amongst all these tragedies or tragic events, we still have this voice of art and expression, which I think bonds us.
Actually, it brings people together.
Yeah, in many ways. And you said, Kevin, you mentioned that African Americans have greatly inspired other diasporas, for instance. And I would like to hear you how it is true, particularly in dance and music, why, like, for Montreal Steppers, for example, what was like your path through this group, and you were mentioning with Black Lives Matters, and how it like created a sense of, okay, now we can talk through arts or through other.
So growing up Hakka Mauritian, and for those who are unfamiliar with Mauritius, it's a tiny little island in East Africa. My relationship to, or questionings around Afro-Asian intimacies and relations have always been part of my upbringing, or just questions in general that I've never seemed to have found any answers to until more recently, in terms of my own exploration in the kind of scholarships that are happening in that area. But kind of having that as part of my cultural background and informing the ways in which I think about, you know, my Asian identity in relation to that, right? Because it's, you know, culturally speaking, it's very different. And then contending and negotiating that growing up, and then having grown up in a neighborhood that is very diverse, and finding commonalities between, for example, you know, Mauritians who speak Creole, like when I speak with Haitian folks, they're like, oh my gosh, you speak Creole, and then that just bonds us together automatically, even though our Creoles are not the same, but we find words that are very similar, and then relations begin to emerge from those kind of intimacies and relations. And so I think a lot about how that has framed the way I have emerged into this world, right? And also my relationship with everyone in Montreal Steppers who are near and dear to me personally, who I call family. We are preoccupied by the same desires about how we navigate this world as marginalized people, as racialized people, how we navigate this world within the ongoing violence that's happening and enacted on Black people in particular, how this world is constructed, right? The world that we are on, that we live in now, this kind of racial capitalistic world that is predicated on the perpetual unfreedom of Black people and unfreedom of Indigenous peoples is central to how we think about what would our work, what does it do, right? When we say that we're working towards a project of liberation, does it actually do anything when we put it out there? Like, we could say that it's for this, or we could say that it's advocating for racial injustice. We could say all these things, but when we take a moment to really see what the work is doing, right? Kind of like what you were saying earlier about, like, you know, film versus like just a live performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something that's archived, something that stays, it kind of has a life of its own. What impact does that have? And so, you know, when we think about movement and dance, it's like literal stepping on land, right? What does that mean when we channel memories and relations by stepping on land that is not, quote, our homeland, right? Mm-hmm. And so it gets us thinking a lot about those relationships more deeply in terms of what that means for us as people and how we understand future making as we continue. Yeah.
I would like to, because you were talking about this difference between video work and work for the stage. I would like to ask you this question because I'm curious about like how you can speak about the difference between your video work and your stage work, in the sense that you can express differently the topics you want to share with audience,
right,
on stage or on the camera. How do you express that differences, or how can you speak about these differences?
Yeah, I think when I started to do both, no, hang on, I want to say something to complement your thing, and then I will move to that. But I also want to say that I'm very interested and fascinated by movement of solidarity between specifically Asian community and Black community, and it's very hard to find the information because we live in a society that goes through white lens. So, and of course there has been a lot of like racial, racist and violent even between the two communities, but there's also been a lot of events of like solidarities between the two communities for like hundreds of years, and you never hear about them.
That's true.
And you know, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be another great
Yeah. We could make like a history class on that, you know, because you never hear about it. Yeah. And and then the thing about stage and video, the two complement each other. So it's like I do stage, and then the year after I do video, and then the year after I do stage, and so I navigate between the two. And when I started, there was this idea of like the importance of the lens. So when you're on stage, there is no lens between you and the audience. But when you use the camera, there is the lens. And it would allow me to do very different things, especially in video. But then over time, what I realized, the main difference and the main enrichment there was consisted in the process, because the process is completely different. When you're on stage, you work a lot, and then everything happens on one day, and then it's over. Whereas like video, you can finish pretty much anytime you want, like you desire. So the control you have over what you want to say is more, like you have more time to think about it. You can change your mind. You can decide to not distribute your film anymore. Like you can decide on a lot of things, but it also stays forever. You know, so the process and temporality is completely different, and I think both are very interesting, and I like the adrenaline of doing a show on stage. I think there is also something very beautiful in doing something meaningful at a certain time, and the video work. I think I can really take more distance with what I'm trying to say. How do I say it? You know, like, and so I also find that very amazing that I'm allowed to more freedom because I have more control over my process.
Puis est-ce que tu penses que le fait d'aller travailler au Vietnam aussi ou dans divers pays à l'étranger, démarrer des processus de création à l'étranger. Est-ce que tu crois que la caméra permet aussi de ramener, est-ce que ça fait partie de ta réflexion de dire, OK, je veux ramener ce que j'ai vécu, t'as comme des témoignages, puis ça te permet un peu de faire voyager aussi ton travail à travers la caméra, ce que le live permet pas nécessairement, à moins que tu te déplaces avec ton show, mais
en fait, je me déplace avec mes shows.
Oui, je sais.
Non, mais je veux dire...
Est-ce que la caméra permet quand même de ramener des images auxquelles on n'aurait pas accès autrement?
Je pense que, I think in a visible way, yes, but in an invisible way, all my creation process start in Vietnam. So then I start there, and it's really, ça m'aide vraiment à élaguer comme qu'est-ce qui est important ou pas. Parce que je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de choses qu'on fait par mimétisme et on ne s'en rend pas nécessairement compte. Quand je vais au Vietnam, ou surtout au Vietnam, parce que j'ai aussi des proches avec qui je travaille là-bas, mais quand j'y vais, je suis obligée de déconstruire ce que je fais et pourquoi je le fais. Fait que je garde uniquement ce qui est essentiel, puis ce en quoi vraiment je crois profondément. Et ensuite, je ramène tout ça, puis je travaille à Montréal et je fais le travail inverse. Fait que ça se nourrit beaucoup. Puis je pense qu'en effet, des personnes qui viennent voir une performance où je danse ne se rendent pas nécessairement compte, mais ça a voyagé, puis ça a nourri le processus. Et je te dirais qu'à la caméra, pour moi, un exercice qui est plus tricky, c'est justement de ramener des images, mais de ne pas tomber dans les images que les gens ici veulent voir. Tu vois, alors il y a quelque chose de toujours garder une forme de réalité et en même temps l'imaginaire que moi je transmets dans la caméra. Mais de ne pas tomber dans ce qu'eux veulent voir ici. Et ça, des fois, c'est difficile. Des fois, tu as des films qui ne tournent pas parce que c'est pas assez. Puis je suis comme, c'est comme ça.
Yeah, I love what you said about where the origins of your film comes from, right? Or where your mind, your headspace is, right? When you begin to work on a project. And just kind of going back to the whole film and stage and live and post-edit kind of dynamic, it got me thinking about like how there's like a different practice of being present, right? And there's like a different idea of time as well, right? What time means and what time permits, but also what time activates, right? And so the kind of live performance element, right, it demands a presencing of everyone at a particular time and space, which may quite literally resonate with you, right? I'm thinking about our most recent show, the Montreal Steppers show, where it was our first live since the quarantining and all that stuff. But we had done like a virtual show the year before, and so this one was like an extension or like a live version of that one, and the ways in which it touched people and reached people was very different, right? The responses that we've gotten between the live and the recorded version is very, very different. And what I'm hearing from those conversations and those comments and feedback and praise was it got them, right? It was like a visceral reach as opposed to, which is not to say that a film doesn't have that capability or ability to reach someone on a visceral level, but I think the kinds of sounds that emerge from it, or the kinds of vibrations and resonance, right?
Stamina.
Yeah, it's so, I find, I mean, I'm not smart enough to say what I want to say, but what I want to say is just like, it's so magical, right? Like when we think about these things. So I'm just going to pause there because it's just magic. Yeah. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Beautiful.
And one last thing about when I go film there, or when I go work there, so I'm interested in, I've been interested in building like a network in southern countries for a couple of years now. So right now I'm mostly in Asia, but I'm also working with African choreographers. And when I go to Asia specifically, this is where I feel like my sense of responsibility is the highest, because I'm Western for them, you know. So, and I'm not considered as Vietnamese. I actually have another name. We're being named Viet Kieu. So it's people who grew up or were born outside, and in that context, I feel 10 times more responsible and accountable than when I'm here, and over there, then my preoccupation about what is fair, what is ethical, gets very like disturbed, because it's very different. I work with all kind of people, and I work a lot with European diasporic people, and they are different too, you know, and it's also very interesting. That's what it's a very positive challenge for me to reflect on what is fair how it's fair to treat people, pay people, collaborate with people, give, take, you know, and but it's very challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, it gets you thinking about what are real needs to the people of that place and in that time, right? What we constitute as a need or a compensation here might not be something that is necessary in somewhere like Vietnam, right? Yeah,
and you have to dissociate what is the individual versus the collective.
Yeah.
So because you set some parameters.
On va devoir s'arrêter là. C'était vraiment très, très intéressant. Puis ça a ouvert des portes à tellement d'autres discussions qu'on pourrait avoir. Merci beaucoup.
Absolutely.
Merci Kellen, merci Kim-Sanh.
Merci,
toujours
Valérie.
un plaisir. Merci à tous d'avoir été présents aujourd'hui. Donc, il y a une autre conversation avec d'autres merveilleux artistes à venir au mois de juin. La discussion d'aujourd'hui a été enregistrée, donc il est toujours possible d'aller la voir sur le site de Dialogue Danse Actuelle de Art Circulation. Donc, merci à tous et je vous souhaite une belle journée au soleil. Au revoir.
Merci.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Merci.